So with the advent of the internet, with the advent of social media, with the advent of streaming, we don't have very many what I'll call like monocultural experiences anymore. So like, for example, my college orientation, this was like 1994, and it happened to be the day that the OJ Bronco chase happened. And there were one of these like big, first gen big screen televisions in the cafeteria, and everybody's huddled around this thing, consuming the thing at the same time, right? And growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had all kinds of these moments, right? But now, with the phone being the main kind of conveyor of status or whatever, we don't have a lot of these. So sports provides these kind of great monocultural events.
Welcome to the Kalos Center podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Kalos Center podcast. Our guest today is Ted Kluck. Ted is Associate Professor of Communication Arts at Union University and a prolific writer, most of which deals either with sports or theology. His work has appeared in ESPN, the magazine, the Sports Spectrum, ESPN.com, and he has a regular column in the Jackson Sun. Ted has co-authored dozens of books, including Facing Tyson and The Extraordinary Life of a Mediocre Jock, and on the theological side, Why We're Not Emergent and Why We Love the Church, both of which are co-authored with Ted's frequent partner in literary crime, Kevin DeYoung. And also work that is concerned with both sports and theology, The Reason for Sports, a Christian Manifesto. He has authored The Christian Gentleman's Smoking Companion, as well as The Gut Check Guide to Publishing, both of which are co-authored with Zach Bartels. Ted's work is critically acclaimed, and two of his books have won Christianity Today awards. Ted also co-hosts two podcasts, one with Zach Bartels called the Gut Check Podcast, and one that's simply called Kluck. Finally, Ted is the blessed husband of one Kristen Kluck, and they are the proud parents of two grown sons. So, Ted Kluck, my irrepressible friend, welcome to the Kalos Center podcast.
Man, it is so good to be here, and it's so good to see your face, brother. And our friendship goes back a long way, man. You were the, cool professor with mystique at Taylor University, and our wives were friends. They married each of us respectively, and then we were kind of thrown together, which just for me resulted in this really surprising friendship. I was a little bit intimidated by you due to you being the cool prof, and I was just this young guy trying to get my feet underneath me, and we started talking about the New Orleans Saints back in the day, and you came to watch me play semi-pro football, and the rest is publishing and academic history.
That's right. I remember the first time we visited your apartment, a studio apartment in downtown Muncie, Indiana.
Yeah.
And I remember just kind of looking at your desk and saw there was poetry there that you had written. And to me at the time, you're just this jock. And I thought, what? This guy actually thinks he can write? Ha, ha, ha.
Yeah, right. No, I know.
30.
Thanks for just picking at my greatest fear there,
right.
Just going right to the pain point.
Oh, I got
That's
more.
Good.
I got more.
Yeah, all right.
30 books later, I have to say, maybe you can write, Ted. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, what's crazy about that is, number one, great apartment. That apartment was incredible. It had the three big vertical windows, the big steel door. It was like a TV apartment. Right across the street from the Herat there in Muncie. You remember that spot? And dude, I don't know why, but I was dabbling in poetry, and then I got some poems published, and I realized that poetry publishers paid in copies of the magazine. And I remember having this feeling literally no one in my life will want this. I can't think of one person to give this to. And that's when I decided to lean into sports and the stuff that I know. But man, it's been a wild ride. The Lord's been incredibly kind to give me my wife, who really encouraged me to write, and some great people, some great professors along the way. Dr. Joe Burnworth, your old colleague, who was just a gem of a human being and a real encouragement to me. And the Lord's allowed some things to pop. So it's been a cool run.
Yep. Wow. Well, keep it going, my man. My introduction really just scratched the surface in terms of summarizing your publication. So let me just begin with these questions. how did you become such a prolific writer, and how much caffeine do you consume on a daily basis?
Yeah, so the thing about writing was, and this kind of dovetails into what we're going to talk about vis-a-vis athletics. When I was an athlete, I was a freakishly hard worker, and my dad had kind of instilled in me this idea that I wasn't a great athlete and I had to outwork everybody. So I just had a kind of maniacal approach to it. And then for a while, it seemed like the Lord was going to take football away from me. And really, that was a kindness. He was disabusing me of an idol, which I desperately needed at the time, although I didn't see it that way. But then when I found writing, I just kind of took that idea of being a freakishly hard worker, really efficient, and just started going for stuff in the writing space. So yeah, first it was poetry, and then I got this little opportunity to write with ESPN the magazine doing humor. And that just kind of took off. I was able to parlay that into other opportunities with them. And then my first book, Facing Tyson, was the product of me meeting a guy in Orlando, Florida, who was sweeping his sidewalk, who happened to be former heavyweight champion Pinklin Thomas. And so we struck up a friendship. He asked me to write his life story, which I had no idea how to write books. I flew home and Googled how to write a book proposal and just kind of went after it, man, and dove in. And from being a writer yourself, you get told no some, you take some shots, you take some hits. And I think football taught me, I don't have thick skin. I grieve things hard, but I don't grieve them for very long. And so when I would get a no, or I would have a closed door, I would grieve it, and I would grieve it hard, but then just get on the horse immediately and keep going. And so I'm really grateful that the Lord was able to build some of those things into me that allowed me to do this for a living, which is rare.
So it always feels personal, right? The rejections, right? Because
yeah.
If you are a writer, if that is part of your essence, then no matter how formal or gentle or whatever the rejection is, it always stabs you in the heart, doesn't it?
Gosh, yes. Yeah. And I think it's one of these really weird tensions, right? Where being intensely personal probably allows us to be good writers, right? Especially in the interview room as you're connecting with people and putting them at ease and asking hard questions, so that's not a skill set that I wanted to lose when I would hear these writing, professionals say you got to have thick skin. And I'm like, man, I just don't think I have it. I think I'm very thin, but it is personal and you want to keep it personal.
Well, the thin skin's all right.
Yeah.
If you get motivated by the pain. And again, it is like football is a great analogy because you have 4 chances to make a first down. You have multiple plays to get to the end zone. And you, on any given drive, usually there will be lost yardage. There will be pain along the way and frustration.
Absolutely.
But you still reach the end zone.
That's it. Physical pain, emotional pain. You lose a rep. You got 30 seconds to grieve it and then expunge it and try to solve the problem, And I think I will always love that about football, and it will always be fascinating to me on that level. Writing turned out to be not so dissimilar, which was crazy.
So your book, Facing Tyson, that fascinated me from the start. Just the whole premise there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, it was my first book. It was the fruit of meeting this guy, Pinklin. I was visiting my in-laws in inland Florida. It was about 180 degrees and I was bored. And I did a very out-of-character thing for an introvert, which is go and introduce myself to a person who looked vaguely familiar. And he had this fascinating story where he was a heroin user for the balance of his career, and he would use in between fights and then get clean long enough to train and fight. And he just had this fascinating story, and I wanted to write it. And at that point, I had done some short form stuff for ESPN. I was really kicking the tires on, can I be a longer form writer? Can I tell the long interview and do that well? And so I wrote Pink's chapter. That was the kind of proposal piece, the pitch piece. And then, I ended up doing this thing where I interviewed 15 guys who fought Mike. I got to interview Mike.
What was that like? What's Tyson like in person?
Oh my gosh, Jim, fascinating. You would love him. He's one of the most, and he's become a bit of a self-parody in the last 20 years, right? He's doing the weed stuff and the mushroom stuff, and he's kind of become sad. But at the time, he was at the end of his career. It was right after his fight with Kevin McBride, who knocked him out in the MCI Center in Washington, D.C., and I was there, and I thought, this guy's going to be a monster. He's just going to be surly and sullen. And he was the opposite. He was reflective. He was introspective. He understands, Jim, the total depravity of man and of his own heart more than many believers that I've met. He really feels guilt and pain for his sin life. And I will always find a person like that to be compelling and trustworthy. Sure. And that's exactly what he was. He was fascinating. I could have listened to him talk for hours. He was a storyteller, just one of these preternaturally gifted people. And I remember after that interview, I prayed for him, and I prayed for him for quite some time because I thought this would be a compelling heart for the Lord to draw to himself. And, it appears that hasn't happened yet, but I still find him interesting. I watched his bit of theater with Jake Paul, and it was sad and all of that. But fascinating character, and really every single guy I interviewed for that book was so interesting to me. I was young enough. I think I was like 28, 29 when I was doing that. So I was still wide-eyed. I was still, pretty innocent myself. And it was just a fascinating experience. And the stories kind of wrote themselves,
Sure, yeah. So just to kind of pull back a bit and just to talk about sports more generally, massively popular throughout the U.S. and globally. Many sports, soccer is a worldwide phenomenon. In the U.S., football, baseball, basketball, hockey, increasingly soccer.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what would you say the reason is for athletic events being so popular, and not just now, but down through history? What is the popular appeal?
Yeah. Well, I'll address the now part first because I think it's really interesting. So with the advent of the internet, with the advent of social media, with the advent of streaming, we don't have very many what I'll call monocultural experiences anymore. So for example, my college orientation, this was 1994, and it happened to be the day that the OJ Bronco chase happened. And there were one of these big, first gen big screen televisions in the cafeteria, and everybody's huddled around this thing, consuming the thing at the same time, right? And growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we had all kinds of these moments, right? But now, with the phone being the main kind of conveyor of status or whatever, we don't have a lot of these. So sports provides these kind of great monocultural events. So I mentioned Tyson, and, being a teacher on a college campus, it was absurd to me that my students were experiencing a Mike Tyson fight night, because this was the purview of guys our age in the 90s. And so for Tyson to be fighting again, even though it was a gentleman's agreement and it was just theater or whatever, my students got to experience the kind of hype and the build-up and the excitement of a Tyson fight night and a monocultural moment that they were all consuming together at the same time. So I think that's a big part of the appeal now. It gives people something to talk about down through the ages. And this is not a new take or a fresh take, but I think it's been a way to bring different people together around a common thing. So I've said for a long time, so one of your questions was, are you still an athlete? I am. I'm still playing. So I want to play till I'm 50. I play in 1 or 2 football games every year. I'm 49 now. I hope to keep doing that. And I coach at an HBCU called Lane College, which is a Division II HBCU. And I've long said I've never seen race relations work better than in a sports context. So I'm the only white guy on staff at this HBCU. I've done it for a decade. I've had nothing but amazing experiences. They've been so kind, so warm. The relating has been rich. So I think that's why I keep going back, because you're in search of the magical moment, not only athletically, but relationally. And sports has provided a lot of that. You said you had a theory on this. I want to hear yours.
Okay. So
yeah.
My theory, I think I would argue it explains why sports would be the thing that so many people would be willing to fasten on in real time. I mean, what
Yes.
you've identified is that fact, but there's a deeper question. What makes sports worth that rather than some other thing?
Okay.
And I think it has to do with the fact that athletic events, when the games are well designed, They provide us with essentially loosely scripted improvisational theater
Yes.
and drama. You have a narrative that the game last night between the Pacers and the New York Knicks, great example of something almost Elizabethan in terms of what kind of compelling drama that provided.
Yes.
It was improvisational in that you don't know what's coming next. In rare cases, like at the end of a football game, say, where it's basically decided in the last minute, it's going to be the genuflect kneel down just to run out the clock.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you don't know what's coming next. But you have a drama there that there's a kind of thematic quality there. We can talk about a game in terms of the highlights or the theme of the game, who the stars were, the ebb and flow. If you're like me, I'm sure you can kind of report to your wife or whomever when they ask about a game, well, how'd it go? And, you can start from the first quarter or the first inning and run through the whole thing, almost play by play.
Yeah.
It's a compelling narrative. It is theater.
Yes.
And for that reason, it is a subcategory of our love of beauty.
Yes.
Which is universal.
Yes. Oh, that's good. I'll give you, a couple of personal examples and then a global example. So personally, more and more, I find myself less a fan of teams and more drawn to certain aesthetics. Like, I just love the way the Shanahan wide zone offense looks when I watch it. And so I'm drawn to that. I'll watch that. There are certain uniform experiences. There's I like watching games that took place on the old AstroTurf, even though it was hellish and brutal to play on. And I know there's something nostalgic in there happening, but I just am drawn to certain experiences like that. And I think it's so true what you're saying. The global example is, 2 years ago when Aaron Rodgers made his big debut with the New York Jets. And for a couple of months, he's the king of the greatest city in the world, right? He's the king of New York City and he's everywhere. And he goes out and he takes the second snap of the game and he tears his Achilles, or the fourth snap or whatever it was. And to your point, I turned to my wife and I said, this is Shakespearean. This is just, there's something bigger happening here. And I happen to think it's, it was the Lord calling Rodgers to humility and repentance at some level. There's got to be a bigger purpose for this. And I think more and more, the older I get, I'm drawn to those kinds of stories in sports. You know what I mean?
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's these human lives that matter.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And for all of the theater and the competitive compellingness of these games, and for all of our absolute devotion to our teams, what matters most is the consequences for these human souls that are involved.
That's it.
And they've got their own life dramas. They have their families. Who knows what's going on with their kids, their wives, their loved ones. And it's easy to miss when you love a team. But as you get older, of course, hopefully our values mature. And I think that's why I have the same experience. And in that perspective, you could probably agree with this. It takes the sting out of even heartbreaking losses.
Sure,
sometimes.
Absolutely. If you've seen something beautiful, if you've seen a great performance, there have been games as a player, as a coach, even as a fan that I've walked away from where Kristen, my wife, would think that I would be really wrecked by an outcome. And I've just been like, no, that was beautiful, man. That was hard fought. I loved it. I loved the experience. Everybody did their best. There was gentlemanliness exhibited. Now, that's not always there, but when it is, it's really special. And I think it speaks to that part of us, Jim, that is created in God's image. I'll give you another example. Tell me if this drifted through your transom at all. This is a few years ago when Andrew Luck retired unexpectedly. He gave the most amazing press conference, and I think I even wrote about it. I wrote that it was the most Christian press conference I'd ever heard. Despite him, I think he's not Christian. I don't know Andrew Luck to be a believer, but the things he was saying, the humility he was saying them with, really resonated with me as a believer. And I'm like, man, that's the thing I've always wanted to see from all these kneel down, chest thumping, cross on the wrist tape Christian athletes. That presser was the one that I'd always wanted to hear, you know?
I haven't seen that.
You should watch it. Yeah, go back and watch it. It was real unusual. So it was like after a preseason game, he just like walked off the field and went into the press room and was like, I'm retiring. And then he gave this like 20-minute through a veil of tears thing where he's thanking the equipment guy and the clubhouse manager and like all these people who had been good to him in his career. And man, it was rich, you know, and it was not a part of the contest itself, but it was one of these athletic moments you just look at it and go, there's a lot of good happening here. Yeah.
Yeah, I always admired that guy, and not just as a Colts fan. I thought he handled himself well.
I agree.
All the way to the end. Yeah, and there is a kind of exquisite beauty even in the tragic losses. And I say that as a Chicago Cubs fan, as a Detroit Lions fan, you know, some perennial losers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that that part's Elizabethan, too.
It sure is, man. So as a Lions fan, let me ask you a quick question. So my poor son, Tristan, with whom I've shared football his entire life, I coached him when he was little. I've gotten to play with him. I've gotten to suit up with him in 5 games.
Oh, that's great.
Which is just a dream come true for a dad. It's unreal, dude. To be sweating, bleeding in a huddle. You look across, you see your son. He's a better athlete than me. He's a freak, dude. But yeah, sadly, I raised him as a Lions fan because we were in the Detroit media market at the time, and this poor kid, like, who's a vicious competitor, just growing up watching his team go 3-13 every year, but loving Matthew Stafford and seeing Stafford just get the crap kicked out of him physically and get up off the deck time and time again, so tough. It was really fun for us to see him go to LA and win a ring, you know? And even though it wasn't our team, quote unquote, it was like awesome to see that happen for him.
That's our guy.
That's our guy. Yeah, for sure.
And who knows, you know, maybe the Lombardi Trophy will be hoisted in Detroit. We have reason to be hopeful.
We do.
In a way that we haven't had in at least
that'd be something, wouldn't
really
it?
My lifetime. You know, I think about 1970 and 91, you still knew that, you know, in 70 the Cowboys and the Vikings were better, but who knows? Yeah. Maybe I was so young. It was like my first season I ever followed, and I cried when they were ousted 5-0 in that playoff game. And then in 91, knew that the Redskins were better. But now, okay, they just might not only have a decent shot at the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
It feels like they are one of the best, if not the best team in the NFC.
Well, talk about fun teams to watch, right? So, like, I'm an O-line guy. I love offensive line play, and they've just built this unbelievable line that they can run behind. They can play action off of it. You know, Jamison Williams as the burner, Amon-Ra as the underneath guy. It's just so fun to watch, man. Yeah. And the uniform is a beauty, dude. The Honolulu blue and the silver, that's always been a nice time, you know?
I remember as a kid thinking, man, it's unfair. You know, my favorite animals, as with a lot of young boys, are tigers and lions.
Absolutely.
And growing up in Detroit, it's like, how can I be so lucky? I've got my baseball team named the Tigers and my football team named the Lions, and then you get the Red Wings. That's the coolest logo in all of sports.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. So the 1970 Lions, would that have been like Carl Sweetan, Milt Plum? Like, who was the quarterback then?
It was Greg Landry and Bill Munson. Yeah, I can go through the whole lineup. You had Steve Owens at running back, Altie Taylor, Earl McCullough, and who was another wide receiver. And he had Mike Lucci as a linebacker.
Oh, I love Lucci. Super cool looking guy, cool glasses. Yeah.
Started a fitness center in Detroit.
Outstanding. Yeah, you love to see it. Did you ever watch, this is getting real deep, man, and we'll get back on track here momentarily. One of my all-time favorite movies is a 1968 Alan Alda movie called Paper Lion. Did you ever see it?
Yeah. George Plimpton?
George Plimpton. That was my first favorite book. My dad brought it home for me from a trip. My dad was a pilot, and I had no idea this was literature. I had no idea that Plimpton was like this amazing writer. I just thought it was a really cool story. You know?
That was a pivotal moment for you.
It was huge, dude. Yeah, it was massive. So shout out to my dad for bringing me that.
Explain the premise of that for our listeners.
So the premise was, it was 1963, and, you know, obviously pre-internet and being able to Google people and find out their background, but what had happened was George Plimpton was the editor of the Paris Review, and he was kind of an armchair weekend athlete. And he said, wouldn't it be cool if I went undercover as a last string quarterback for the Detroit Lions in their training camp and wrote about the experience, kind of inside what an NFL training camp looked like. And he developed these rich friendships with like Alex Karras, who was an amazing character, John Gordy, these bigger than life characters, and Night Train Lane, Dick Night Train Lane was on that team, and, just wrote this incredible piece of what we now call immersive journalism or creative nonfiction. We didn't have those categories back then. But man, I just fell in love with it. And I would read it every fall before my season started as kind of like a pregame, to my experiences. And
that's good.
Unbeknownst to me, that was making me a good writer, I think.
Yeah. Now, was that made into a documentary?
No, it was made into a narrative film in 1968.
Yeah.
So Alan Alda played Plimpton. And
that's right.
Yeah, yes. Lauren Hutton was in it, and Karras and Gordy. The unique thing about that in the pantheon of sports films is that they use the actual athletes as actors. And so Karras went on to have this career as an actor, but he had a kind of natural crackle of charisma.
Yeah.
Of course, Alan Alda was Alda.
I think Alex Karras was in some Mel Brooks films, or at least Blazing Saddles.
No, he was in Blazing Saddles famously. He's really great in that. And he
punches the horse.
Yeah, punches the horse. That's right. And
he'd never get away with that today.
No, gosh, no. But Karras was amazing. And my dad and I, we loved that film. It came on like cable late at night one night. He let me stay up late with him and watch it. Really formative. So
do you have a favorite sport? I mean, it's sounding like football is your favorite. But
yeah, I mean, my dad was a small college offensive line coach. He coached at Taylor in the early 80s. And he would bring me out to the practices when I was like 6, 7 years old. I just fell in love with it. I loved everything about it and loved playing. And yeah, I think football is my first love. Boxing is probably a close second. In early adulthood, I started boxing. I sold it to my wife as like, I need to go experience this so that I can write about it better. But really, I just wanted to do it. And so, I've been doing that on and off for the last, 20, 25 years and have loved that. And, those are my two big ones. But, I get romantic about baseball in the summer. I'll watch some innings of baseball and get romantic about that. And I enjoy watching playoff hockey. That's a fun time. So
it is absolutely frenetic, isn't it?
It's so frenetic. And, I think you had a question in there. It's probably the next question. Whether I objectively think my sport is the best sport. My answer to that is no. Because, one of the great things about sports writing was I got to be ringside at a lot of pro fights. I got to be courtside for a lot of NBA games. And I just marveled at the skill. One of my favorite things to do covering the NBA was to go really early and watch the shoot-arounds and the warm-ups. And just seeing these guys hit from wherever on the floor when they were unguarded, I just marveled at it. So I think in watching playoff hockey, the speed, the violence, the endurance, there's something magical about every sport. And my grandpa, who pitched in the Cubs system, way back in like the 20s and 30s, he said the hardest thing to do in sports was to hit a fastball. And I trust his judgment. I do. So I think I find a little something about all of them to just marvel at. And that's a lot of fun.
George Will, the great conservative political commentator, once said that one of the great values of sports, professional sports, is they give us clear examples of excellence.
Yeah. Oh, good. Mm-hmm.
And that's true about all of them. He was just a diehard baseball fan, and he preferred baseball. He would have said that baseball's the superior sport.
Yeah.
And he would sometimes make pejorative comments about football.
I know.
When kind of exalting baseball. I don't think you need to do that, but he did. And one of the things he said that is very memorable is football features the two things we hate most about American life: violence and committee meetings.
That's so great. And I remember that quote. It was a great one. I disagree, although I agree on the violence, right? And I actually agree on the committee meetings too, now that you mention it. And you come out of the academic world, and we have to sit through a lot of committee meetings, and they are largely meaningless and a waste of time. And this is one of the instances where I thank God for the internet and the smartphone, right? Because eBay has been my friend during many a committee meeting. But the meetings in football are the most efficient versions of a meeting. They're 30 seconds. They're between plays. Decisions are made quickly. Collaboration is efficient. One of my favorite authors, Jim Harrison, who wrote Legends of the Fall, said, football is war without guns. And I think that's apropos, and I think Americans, good, bad, or indifferent, are drawn to that. And it feels, Jim, and I know I'm making this argument for football being better. I don't even mean to do that. But it feels like the stakes are higher because there's only 16 or 17 games, right? And there is this violent toll that the game takes on your body where you play it on a Saturday or Sunday, and if you're lucky, you feel almost okay by the next Saturday or Sunday, and then you have to go out and do it again. And so there's high stakes to it. All the games matter. I think it is kind of magical in that.
And it really is. It's conceived on the military model because, one, it's a ground acquisition game. You're trying to take the other team's land.
Yeah.
And you do so through a ground attack.
Yeah, that's right.
And you have an aerial attack. And some of the even basic schematics in terms of defending against that attack have direct parallels to military strategy.
Flanking, the blitz. Yeah, absolutely. And man, for a little boy, that was just beyond compelling. And to me, it was like, you know how all little boys are kind of into the superhero thing? It was the closest you could get to actually being a superhero. The muscle, the outfit, the bright colors, the pageantry, the violence. I just needed it shot into my veins on a regular basis. Yeah.
There's something about that time of year. Once August gets there and you can feel the football season coming.
That's it.
Oh man, there's nothing like it.
That's right.
For all of your love of sports, an appreciation of the great variety of sports, do you see, or even are you annoyed by flaws in various sports in terms of how they're designed?
Yeah, I'll address that on a personal level and then a broader level again. So, again, the Lord and his sovereignty and kindness, I think, made me aware of some of the greatest flaws in my own heart via sport. So I had this idolatrous relationship with sport, with football, with winning, with strength, that I was just beginning to be disabused of when you met me. I had injured my leg at Taylor. I'd broken it twice. I thought my career was over. I was very bitter about it. In retrospect, it was the greatest kindness. Not the greatest. We know what the greatest kindness is, but it was a great kindness. And then by the time you met me, the leg was feeling good again, and I was starting to kick the tires on playing semi-pro for the Delaware County Thunder.
Yeah, and I went to one of those games. You did. You caught a 2-point conversion.
I caught a 2-point conversion. I had a sack. That was my first game for the Thunder. And I'll tell you, it was joyful in a way that it had never been when I had an idolatrous relationship with football because, clearly all the kind of status was stripped away from it. It was this like meaningless game taking place on a junior high field, and I was just all in on the fun and the joy of it. And by God's grace, he's let me have that kind of relationship with it in perpetuity. And he's given me lots of other playing experiences over the last 25 years that have been full of joy. So yeah, I think it does expose flaws, and I'm still convicted by it from time to time. I was convicted by it as a parent. There were moments with Tristan, I think because he was such a good athlete, where I was just clutching it too tightly and I was too invested in his experience or his approach looking like mine. And man, I'll tell you, it resulted in great moments where I had to come to my child in a posture of repentance and say, please forgive me. And because his heart is tender and regenerate, he extended it. And man, it was beautiful, and our relationship is better for it. And it's one of those things that you realize is only possible because of Christ. So that's an example of the imperfection leading to something redemptive. As far as imperfections on a global scale, there are things that annoy me, like the NFL constantly tinkering with like pass interference rules and kickoff rules and like helmet to helmet collisions. And I would be more of the old school mind of like, yo, this is a violent sport. It's war without guns. We all know what we're getting into. Like, let the strong safety a la Steve Atwater, take the head off of the low crosser, because it's actually a tactical moment where if you want to run an in cut against Denver in the 90s, you know that Atwater is lurking to take your head off. And so maybe you don't run the in cut, or maybe you try to attack the defense in different ways. I think I'm annoyed by that sort of constant tinkering. I'm annoyed by how non-football things, i.e. the draft, have become circuses, and how even the Super Bowl has become kind of a parody of itself. Did you ever read Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace?
No.
Oh, man, that would blow your mind, and I think you would enjoy it. And I know Wallace has become kind of a meme now, but like he wrote, it's a satirical novel set in the written in the late 90s, set in the indiscriminate nowish future. And in the world building of the book, the Super Bowl has just become this like bloated, ridiculous parody of itself, where if you play for the Eagles, you actually fly into the arena like an eagle, and it's part of the pregame pageantry, and it's ridiculous, and it's meant to be. But now I watch the Super Bowl, and I'm like, it's nearly that ridiculous.
Yeah, we're all familiar with junk sports.
Yeah.
The stuff that's really contrived and that's done during off seasons, and you got all that pageantry. Sometimes the Super Bowl begins to feel like that, just a lot of this ridiculous sideshow. And by the time the game starts, it's like, oh yeah, there's a football game coming.
Dude, yes. Have you been to an NBA game lately?
Not lately, but I've been to a few.
Yeah, so I went to one last year. I have a rich friend. It's good to have rich friends, but this guy, he's a banker. He had a box at like a Memphis Grizzlies game. And so, we went and we got to enjoy the like buffet spread of food, and it was around Christmas time, and I get to my seat, which is plush and like an office chair, and there's a TV monitor at the seat. So I couldn't not like flip channels. And it occurred to me that Die Hard was on. One of my favorite movies of all time was on this television. And so I've got like a steak and Die Hard, and there's like a concert happening in one edge of the arena. And it occurred to me that the game itself was completely ancillary. And in fact, very few people were paying attention to it. And it occurred to me that like the regular season NBA experience exists really now just for degenerate gamblers, because, the NBA playoffs are like 6 months long. Almost everybody makes it. Like, it doesn't matter what happens in like, Clippers, Grizzlies in December. This really only matters if you're like addicted to DraftKings or whatever. And so I guess that kind of makes me sad too,
The expansion of playoffs in all the major sports annoys me, because it makes the regular season far less meaningful. Now, the NFL, since there's 17, soon to be 18 regular season games, maybe it's a little different. But in baseball, you got 162 games. Mm-hmm. You can finish with the best record over those, 5-6 months.
Yeah.
And now you're still just one of 6 teams in your league.
Yes.
And it just seems unfair. It's unjust, because it's lack of a proper proportional reward for that achievement.
That's correct. It's like we've had 162 games to figure this out. Did that not stand for anything?
I would be of the old school, and this would make far less money for the league. This is why we know it'll never happen, where you'd play all the games, and then who has the best record in the American League? They play the team with the best record in the National League.
I love it.
And that's that.
I love it. No, that's good. And I think I was kicking the tires on this theory with a friend not too long ago. Tell me what you think about this. I think, and we sound like old men here, and I'll preface with that, but growing up in the 80s and 90s, the best thing about football then, and to a certain degree even the NBA then, because of how TV worked and stuff, was the scarcity, right? Like, I knew that I was going to be with Walter Payton on Sunday, and I would have to wait 7 days to be with him again. And really, like, I would have to wait. If I watch Monday Night Football, I'm still waiting 6 days to be with the NFL again. But now, via the Thursday night games and the blah, blah, and social media and all this, like, extreme exposure to it, we've lost scarcity. And I think it's become gradations less magical as a result.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. As much as I consume it, And I'm at
Yeah.
the Thursday night games, the Saturday games,
I'm in on that
Sunday
too.
afternoon,
Yeah.
Sunday evening.
Tuesday Maction, I'm watching Central Michigan play Ball State in front of like 15 people on a November evening. It's like, this is sick. Why am I watching this?
Well, they do it because they know it'll be consumed.
That's it. Well, and even that is an interesting commentary, right? So like a Tuesday night Central Michigan Ball State game will still pull a higher rating than like the, I don't know, game 2 of some early playoff NBA series. And that's kind of a fascinating thing,
So who are some of your favorite sports personalities?
Yeah.
And why?
Mike Tyson, we mentioned that one. Growing up, Walter Payton was my hero because of the way he played and because my dad liked him. There's always that interesting, like, your dad kind of curates the museum and then gives it to you and says, this is somebody who's courageous and never comes off the field and always plays hard. And, so I love Peyton for that. In fact, did you ever read Jeff Pearlman's like presidential length biography of Peyton? I read through it probably a decade ago and I wept because it essentially pulled back the curtain on kind of what a broken person he was off the field. And, it was kind of this experience of having my hero brought down to earth for me.
What was the deal? I don't know much about his background.
Drugs, philandering of all kinds. He's just a bad husband. He was presented as this kind of joyful, angelic figure, sweetness. The reality was something different.
And a philanthropic guy.
Yeah, philanthropic guy. But, like all of us, he had a sin nature. And, at times it won. And, so that was a sad read. Brian Bosworth. I loved Brian Bosworth when I was an adolescent, with like the hairstyle and he tried
to look like a superhero.
Yeah, he did. And he was like a cool white guy, which we didn't have many of back then. I've never gotten to interview him. I would love to. Did you watch his 30 for 30? You should watch it. It's one of the most redemptive Christian things I've seen in a long time. So the setup of his 30 for 30 this came out 5-6 years ago, and he had a teenage son, and he drove his teenage son to like one of those storage garages that you can rent. And he was just picking through all of his memorabilia, like weeping for the sin that he committed back then. And he was like, I was arrogant. I was a jerk to people. I was horrible to my teammates sometimes. And he's pleading with his son, don't be like me, and dealing with some of his own dad stuff via the Little League kind of tendencies of his own dad. And it was absolutely fascinating. So I love Brian Bosworth. If he's listening, I'd love to do a book with the Bos. Let's see, who else? Our old New Orleans Saints guy, Ricky Williams. I enjoyed the Ricky Williams experience. I thought he was very thoughtful in a Tyson-esque sort of way. Has now himself become kind of an avatar for the weed industry. I love Jordan. I got a chance to meet Jordan when I was writing for ESPN, like year 1 of my career, and Jordan was in the end of his playing career.
The Wizards at that point?
He was with the Wizards, yeah. And they were playing a meaningless game in Detroit against the Pistons, and all his teammates were like listening to music, goofing around before the game, and he was watching film, in his $5,000 suit. He was gracious to me. I'm sure he could tell I was super nervous, but that was
you're in the presence of basketball royalty.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, I had this guy's poster on the wall when I was a kid, I was really fascinated. You'll appreciate this one as a Michigan State grad yourself. Tony Mandarich. Do you remember Tony Mandarich?
Oh, yeah.
I got to interview him for a book chapter once, and boy, was he an interesting guy. Another one of these guys that I had on my wall as a kid is like, I want my body to look like that. I want to be that strong and that intimidating at some point in my life.
If he only had the work ethic to go with it.
Well, what's interesting about Mandarich is that, so he gets drafted, I think number 2 overall that year. It was 1989. Goes to Green Bay.
Who drafted? Yeah, Green Bay.
And he was a famous washout, a bust. And to this day, if you watch those like top 10 videos about the greatest draft busts, he's on those lists. And it was because he was like, he had an addling addiction to painkillers. He was taking 50 painkillers a day just to feel normal. And as any addict would tell you, that became like the chief end of his life, And so he washes out with Green Bay. He's out of the league for like 5 years. And what a lot of people don't know is that he had a third act of his career with the Colts where they brought him in as a kind of journeyman
I remember that.
offensive lineman, and he had 3 or 4 productive years with the Colts, which was awesome, and to me, kind of a great redemptive end cap to that story. He's now like a photographer in Arizona, so he's an artistic guy himself, but
wow,
really fascinating character. Man, I could go on and on. There are so many.
What do you think about Aaron Rodgers?
Man, what a great question. He's another guy I'd love to just do a book with or have a conversation with. I think and I hate to even speculate on this, right? Because I don't know the guy, and I've spent 0 minutes with him. But he seems to have traveled this kind of emergent church path of like, grew up conservative in a church context that you and I would call normal or close to normal. And then he's playing in Green Bay. He has this encounter with Rob Bell, who kind of deconstructs him. And he's kind of remained in this sort of hippy-dippy, deconstructed, always seeking, never finding kind of space. Did you watch the Netflix docs on him?
I did. Fascinating.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating where, these ayahuasca retreats with rich people essentially became his church. There was a liturgy to it where you, fly to Honduras or wherever, and you get high and hungover on this plant medicine. You literally vomit, right? The point of it is to vomit and then sort of have realizations about yourself. And it's all these rich people, vomiting, and they're singing songs. So that's part of the liturgy and meditation. And it occurred to me, man, like what he's looking for is what I have in my local church. And what I have is beautiful. I have people who I'm, in now a decade-long friendship with that involves like singing and praise and prayer and meditation over things that we believe to be true. And there's richness and depth there. And I think Rodgers is just searching for it. I find him to be very entertaining. He's kind of a loose cannon on the McAfee show and just a really interesting... Yeah. He's been willing to zag culturally on some things in ways that I've liked. So I don't know, man. I'm into it just as a cultural item. He's pretty fascinating.
He's an original thinker, bright guy. I think he's still working on his categories. Yeah, he's looking for something that will bring a kind of ultimate coherency to his perspective. I think what he's looking for is a biblical worldview.
Yeah.
I mean, we all want things to make sense. He's in search of that in an especially public way, which is always fascinating.
Gosh, yes.
To watch. Would you say you have a formal theology of sports? And if so, how would you sum it up?
I think as I've gotten older, and this has played out in all kinds of different ways, but my formal kind of working theology of sports is question 1 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which is, what does glorifying God and enjoying Him forever look like in the context of sport? So whether I'm going out to coach or going out to play, I now do so prayerfully, more prayerfully than I did when you knew me when I was young. And I do so kind of with that idea in the back of my mind of what does glorifying God and enjoying Him look like in this context. So the enjoyment comes out in all the little aesthetic things and the way the grass feels on my legs when I stretch and the way it feels to put the uniform on and tape up and the way my son looks when I see him across the huddle. That's just the Lord giving me like 100 cc's of enjoyment, like stat, and I'm like immediately thankful for it. And I think the glorifying God piece hopefully comes to bear on how I coach the kids that I coach and how I relate to them and seeking to love them well and teach them a skill, but giving them really some of the experiences I didn't have as a young player where I was loved by someone, and a lot of my guys at Lane especially, they've never been loved well by an older man. They've never been cared for in a non-on-the-field sort of way. And so I really hope that honors the Lord, and I want it to. So that would be probably a quick flyover of my theology of sport. But I want to ask you the same question. What about you?
Yeah, so I would connect it to what I said earlier about what it is that kind of draws us to sport as fans, as observers. Mm-hmm. And that is the beauty that it offers. Mm-hmm. in creating a sport, in coaching and participating in a sport. I think all of it, whether you're Abner Doubleday, or Babe Ruth, or you and I watching the Tigers say, we're all compelled by beauty somehow. And all of the creation that we do, I do a lot of woodworking and home renovation, and I see my work doing that as not really in a different category ultimately than my writing. Right? I'm creating a certain order out of chaos and hopefully something beautiful. And that's what was achieved when baseball was created and in every game that's played. So that all originates in the creativity and beauty of God, of course. You think about Jonathan Edwards' understanding of, the perfection and infinitude of God. Everything in the cosmos is an emanation from, the being of God. And because it all comes from God, there's beauty and goodness and truth everywhere. So I see it as part of that. It's just that what's unique about sports is that they're recreational and that theatrical. So not like any art form, like any fine art form, they're not necessary for human survival, but they are necessary for, I guess, maximum human flourishing. Some recreational form or another. It doesn't have to be football or baseball or soccer or whatever, but to have kind of formal kinds of play, I think that is really a vital part of human flourishing.
Man, I couldn't agree more. And I think of some of the most joyful play that I've had dating back to like early childhood, right? And you asked who are some of the compelling sports figures. I forgot a couple. One was in early childhood, Pete Rose. I love Pete Rose. So I was in East Central Indiana, kind of within striking distance of Cincinnati. I got to see him play. He had the same like stupid, derpy, like bull haircut that like me and me and all my friends had that haircut in like 1983, and so, we're going out in the backyard and like painting lines on the vacant lot, pretending to be Pete Rose doing Petey's, you want to get that slip and slide out and do a Petey into it. And
he was the only one that was doing that for a while.
That's right, man.
Head first slide.
But it was just like a formative part of who I am now, and it's not a big part, but it's like in there somewhere. And even just like the way you wear the uniform and the way you play. And like, it occurred to me as you were talking, with every sports figure that I've resonated with, there's always been an aesthetic element. Like I remember late 90s, early 2000s, Ohio State had a linebacker named Andy Katzenmoyer, the big cat. And he played my position. He was about my size. I mean, way better than me, bigger, faster, stronger, the whole thing. But I love the way he looked, like the stance, the way he wore the helmet, the visor, the neck roll. It was all kind of aspirational and pleasing to me, And so you go to it to be pleased in some way, I think. Which is why, Jim Spiegel, you and I need to write the multi-volume Theology of Sport. I think
there you go.
I need you to help me do it because I can't do it on my own, but I would very much enjoy that.
I would love that. Yeah. Well, let this be a kind of public gentleman's agreement to pursue that.
Dude, I would love it.
Together.
Let it be a shot across the bow to our agent who we share. Yeah. I don't know, I don't know where you are with your writing career, and this may be too old manish. You may have to cut this out, but I'm like way less ambitious than I used to be. Like fewer things get me excited. And I think like when I was like 33, let's say, just the idea of doing another book was really exciting, and it really didn't even matter what it was about. But now it takes a lot more to like get me off the couch as a writer, but that would do it. That would get me off the couch.
My current project, I have a contract with Cascade Books, and my editor there, you'd love him, Robin Perry, great guy. So I have a contract for a book that's entitled A Thing of Beauty, and the subtitle is How Everything is Art and Art is Everything.
Come on, I'm in.
So, and I will have a chapter dealing with sports as well as with science and history and so on. It's just taking seriously and applying this idea that God is the cosmic artist.
Yeah.
It really, it really has implications for every aspect of human life, whatever we're doing. History is a drama.
Yes.
Science, you're studying the tangible, physical artwork of God and so on. So That's the next project, and that directly relates to what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Dude, that's going to rip. Congratulations. Yeah.
I hope so. Maybe I can get you to do a back cover blurb.
Yeah, I'm in. Yeah.
So the question I always conclude with, you've already addressed to some degree, and that is a question about the meaning of life, right? The ultimate philosophical question.
Yeah.
But just to finish up here, since you've already talked about that in relation to, sports and your interest and involvement in sports, is talk about how your work as a writer is a manifestation of your view of the meaning of life.
Yeah, that's good. Again, like my work as an athlete, I think this has grown over the years as I've grown in my own sanctification, right? I mean, I think by and large, early in my writing career even, it was an exercise in self-glorification. I'm proud. I'm chasing something that I later learned wouldn't satisfy, and whatever it is for you. I thought that like signing an autograph in a book would be fulfilling. It would prove that I was on the planet, that I existed, that somebody cared about me, that I was okay, I had what it took or whatever. And then you have that experience, or, you appear on a TV show to talk about your book or whatever, and you realize none of these things are satisfying. And so one of the interesting things about the Academy, and I'm sure you had to do this in your career, to get tenure, or to get promotion, or to win Faculty of the Year or whatever, you have to essentially build this dossier, which is like this 40 or 50 page document telling them all the stuff they already know about what you do. And I think it's like academic hazing, but in one of those things, I had to write like my philosophy of teaching or whatever. And I think and I use question 1 of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, right? And I want to glorify God. I really do want to enjoy him. So what does that look like laid over my work as a parent, my work as a husband, my work as a teacher? And hopefully on my good days, that idea is driving everything that I do. So now my writing, hopefully at age 49, has a richer fragrance of the Lord in it than it did at 29. When at 29, I was really just trying to show off, and I was doing like, isn't it interesting what I find interesting? Hopefully now my writing is more seasoned with the Lord and maturity and growth and all the scars and the pain that come with it, and all the shots you take along the way and all the moments you have to tell your wife you're sorry and all those rich things that make a life,
Yep. Wow, that's good stuff. Good stuff. Well, this has been great, Ted. Love it. And I'd like to do this again, Mary, periodically.
I would too, man. Yeah, I've always enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center podcast. To get notified when we publish a new episode, please subscribe. And let us know what you think by leaving us a review.